be hearing 348 today. The authors asked us, would we hold that so that we can, Mike can do a little bit more work on that. So, hate to see y'all leave. I know all the university folks love coming to this committee, but don't worry, we're not going to be issuing guns and ammo today. All right, we have two bills by Senator Kirk. Senator Kirk, would you come up? Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
House Bill 367. You want to do that one first?
Yes, Senate Bill 367 deals with indemnification. And Mr. Tolbert here has done a substitute to that bill, and I think the committee has that substitute now, and I'm perfectly fine with that substitute. All it does is kind of qualifies the order that it would go in if an officer died or a first responder died in the line of duty, much like the two officers that we had in Americus, Georgia, both young men, never had been married, had no dependents, so the families did not get the indemnification. Had I known this was an issue, we would have dealt with this last year when we increased the indemnification from $100,000 to $150,000. But this came up as a result of the COPS task force, and that's where this legislation came from. So I'll be happy to answer any questions that the committee may have, and I do ask for your favorable consideration.
Would you like to go over your bill and just talk about the line briefly?
Yes, sir. If you'll notice, on line 17 is where it starts in the following priority, and that's what this change was, why we have a substitute. On line 18, to the surviving unmarried unremarried spouse of the deceased or the organically brain damaged person. I think we also added that language in there. Mr. Tolbert can correct me if I'm wrong. For line 20, if no surviving unremarried spouse, then it goes to the dependents of the spouse. If no surviving unremarried spouse or dependents of the spouse, then it goes to the dependents of the deceased person or the organically brain damaged person. And then in lines 24 through 25, if no surviving unremarried spouse or dependents of the spouse of deceased person or organically brain damaged person, then to the estate of the deceased person. And that's what we were trying to get at, is that previously it was not able to go to the estate of the deceased first responder. And then on line 26, as provided for by will or operation of the law. So that's it in a nutshell, Mr. Chair. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
All right. Any questions from the committee members? Mr. Clark.
This might sound ignorant on my part, but what is organically brain damage? What's that terminology for?
Well, you may have heard it in layman's term that basically they're in a vegetative state, so that they have maybe sustained a traumatic brain injury to the point that they're brain dead, if you would.
Okay. I just didn't know what the organically, but thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Ms. Frazier.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Kurt, by us passing this legislation, it still will not help the two officers that passed away in Americas, will it?
Yes, ma'am, it would, because it's not going to help the officers, no, but it would.
I mean their families.
It would help their families, yes. They would have been able to receive the indemnification. They were not able to receive. They were killed in December of 2016, and so their families did not receive the indemnification. Now, this law being passed, they would have.
Will
It's not retroactive, no,
okay.
ma'am.
Thank you.
Any further questions from any of the committee members? Do we have anyone here in attendance that wishes to be heard on this bill? My goodness, aren't we a happy crowd today? What's the will of the committee? We have a motion. We have a second. Further discussion? Secondary amendments? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Ayes have it. Who's going to be senator? Who's going to be your House sponsor?
And the House sponsor for this is Representative Burt Reeves.
All right. House Bill 368.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, on House Bill 368, if you'll just flip over to the second page on line 45, What we're doing here is this was something else that came up as a need from the COPS task force. That was made up of chiefs of police, sheriffs, county commissioners, and city council people from across the state. And we met several times last year. And what we're doing is asking CJCC to add these to their duties on line 45 to provide technical support and assistance to any local law enforcement agency to enhance the effectiveness of such agency when the council finds that such local law enforcement agency would otherwise lack access to adequate technical support and assistance. Support and assistance, and we kind of define this for you a little bit, it shall include but not limited to, on line 49, equipment, grant funding, operations, training, and other official local agency needs, and then the rest is the same that's been in the code. So I'll be glad to answer any questions, Mr. Chair.
Any questions from the committee? As I read this, is this not some of the things that CJC does right now?
Yes, Mr. Chair, this is in the realm and in the scope of some of the things that they're already doing. That's correct. We just wanted to codify it and make sure that we were very clear about what we were asking them to do to help with local law enforcement.
Do we have anybody here from CJCC? I see the director. Come on up. Welcome, Jay.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
how are you today?
I'm wonderful. Spread some knowledge on us.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it is true that CJCC is very involved in many of these activities. Some of them we're not involved in at this point in time, and none of them we're involved in to the level that this bill would ask us to be involved. We do have a concern about capacity, being able to have the capacity to accomplish what this bill is asking us to do. We have expertise, but we don't have capacity.
You embellish that a little bit more. You don't have, when you say you don't have the capacity.
Mr. Chairman, to give you an idea of what we do in these areas, as far as training goes, our involvement with training is we have the Burn JAG grant, which is a federal grant, although Burn JAG is now being held up, which is creating some issues for us at this point. Our Burn JAG funds are spoken for the next 3 years. We fund, through Burn JAG, we fund drug task forces. We are funding gang platform, database platform for PAC. We fund some training at Gypstick with that Burn JAG funds, but the Burn JAG funds are spoken for the next 3 years. And at this point, last year's Burn JAG funds have not been released yet, and quite frankly, we are within the last few months of the funding that we have, and if the federal government doesn't release Burn JAG within the next few months, we're going to have some significant issues with Burn JAG funding. We do provide some training along the lines of sexual assault, human trafficking, victim advocacy. We provide that through some of our VOCA grant funding from the federal government, and that training is provided for sexual assault centers and victim advocates and others around the state, and we have law enforcement that attend those trainings. So there is some training for law enforcement through that area, but to be able to have the capacity to increase what we're doing in training law enforcement, for example, we don't have any funding to do that with. We're also concerned about the equipment piece. We don't know what that means. Does that mean that we are going to be required to provide funding for equipment? If so, we don't have funds to provide funding for additional equipment. We have been able to provide palm scanners for local sheriff's departments through some SORNA funds, sexual offender funds. So there's been some limited areas for us to do a little bit of equipment, but if you start, and we also did some bulletproof vests through a federal grant, but to be able to really get into significant statewide funding of equipment, we don't have the funding available for that. We're a little concerned about the providing assistance, technical assistance for local jurisdictions for grant writing. We certainly had the expertise to do that, but during grant season, our grant writers are writing for the competitive grants that we use to fund what we are already doing in the state, and our grant writers during grant season are already, many of them working 50 hours plus a week, and for us to be able to begin now writing grants for local jurisdictions, we just don't have the capacity to do that with our current staffing levels. So there's some concern about how broad this is. When you look at how broad the requests are, the asks are for us, and the expansion of our of what we do as an agency, we just have a lot of concern about capacity to be able to meet the ask in this bill.
All right. Let's see. Mr. Gravely or? All right. Mr. Petrie.
Yes, so Mr. Director, so obviously, so you're opposed to this, is the council opposed to this bill?
We are not opposed to what they are trying to do. We're just wanting you to know that we do not have the capacity to do this.
So you're recognizing you don't have the resources. What this bill does is give you the authority over a new arena, that related to technical support, et cetera. And you alluded to, I was going to ask you some of the examples, and you've given us some good examples. So this gives you the authority over somebody, gives you no funding. And so you wouldn't have the ability to do, to really change anything or to do anything in addition currently. But if there was an appropriation made going forward, you would then have the ability to do that. Is that part, would that be consistent with the mission of the council to do those things, or do you believe it is really out of order?
I think it's an expansion of the scope. To say that it is outside of our mission, I don't think I would go that far, but it is clearly an expansion of what we're doing at this point. I don't think it's so far out that you would say, hey, this is inappropriate to be thinking. No, I don't think that at all. But it is clearly an expansion of our scope.
Do you believe it is a necessary expansion or not? Necessary.
I don't believe it's a. I think it would be difficult for me to say that that's a necessary expansion.
Thank you.
And another issue that I think it would bring, quite frankly, is if we have 4 or 5 or 6 local agencies that are wanting assistance to write a grant for the same competitive grant, then as a state agency, are we now, even if we're staffed up, are we now at that point going to assist multiple agencies in going after the same competitive grant? Or do we make a determination that one agency or 2 or 3 agencies are more deserving than other agencies, and how do we determine which ones those will be? I think that's a little bit of a concern as well.
Mr. Gravely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, how are these, I would imagine that a lot of these departments, offices, or agencies that lack the ability or the access to these types of grants or funding, equipment, training, would be more rural areas where the tax digest just can't afford to be able to do that.
Right.
Mr. Norris may want to speak to this as well, other than, if I may, Mr. Chairman, I'll put you on the spot, but the FOP has come in traditionally in the past. I know, having worked with the FOP in the past on certain things, they will provide ballistic vests for departments or agencies that can't afford some of them, or they'll at least help out. how do we currently address this need right now in the state for departments or agencies or offices, let's just use rural for lack of a better example, that are not able to afford, how is that currently being handled, or is it not being handled at all?
I don't know the answer to how that's being handled. I do know that there have been federal grant opportunities that we have written for and have secured, and we have done subawards for some bulletproof vests and for palm scanners. We've been able to do some things to help, and certainly when we see those opportunities for grant funding from the federal government that provides us an opportunity as an agency to do sub-grant awards around the state, we pursue those. That's one of the things that we do. One of the things that keeps our grant writers busy during grant season is pursuing those type of grants. I think this is more about local agencies writing for grants for local agencies, not a statewide grant that gives us the opportunity to sub-award out around the state.
So if I may, Mr. Chairman. So you're currently doing it, and going back to your previous comment, it would just be an expansion of that overlay, I guess you'd say, when you'd now have departments coming in from all over the state under this legislation asking for, hey, well, this is now available, or we can go through you guys to do it, or, you know, y'all already have grants pending. Can we tap into that? And what you're saying is the funding right now is limited, or it's already allocated or encumbered for X, Y, Z years.
So the federal government, some grants are awarded to SAAs such as us, and we take those grants and we distribute around the state to local jurisdictions. There are grant opportunities from the federal level. They're not probably not as many as we would like to see, but there are grant opportunities from the federal government where local jurisdictions go after those grants for their jurisdiction. And I think that's what this bill is getting at, is for those grants, individualized grants going for a specific jurisdiction, is that we would help those local jurisdictions write those grants for those specific grants for that local jurisdiction.
Okay.
And that's where it becomes an expansion, because we're no longer just writing for statewide grants that are being distributed. Now we're being asked to help these local jurisdictions write those very specific grants that are jurisdiction based instead of state based.
Okay, if I may, I want to try to get to that. And if the author or Mr. Rotundo I see now, or Terry, how are currently for those offices, departments, or agencies that are outside? Again, we'll use a rural police department or a rural sheriff's office that doesn't have that tax digest. They're unable to get certain. How are they being assisted, or how are they going after certain funding mechanisms to be able to get the necessities or the training, equipment, stuff like that?
I can answer that, Representative Gray, because this did come up in the COPS task force, and I'm going to give you a real live example, though. Abbeville, Georgia. Don't get much more rural than Abbeville.
I know where Abbeville is.
Wilcox County. And probably hunted down there somewhere. I hope you hadn't been to jail down there. It's a big prison. But I was visiting one day with the chief of police, and he was sitting at his desk, and I'm sitting across the desk. We're talking. I could tell he was real intense in what he was doing. I said, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm writing a grant." And I'm thinking, here's a guy that has maybe 3 officers on the whole force, maybe 4. I don't know. It's a very, very, very small force. And yet he's sitting here with phones ringing. He's answering this. He's calling 911. He's calling him. You need to go here, there, and yonder, or whatever. And in the meantime, he's trying to write a grant. Well, I don't know if you've ever written a grant before. I have had the privilege, I don't know if that's the right word, to do that, and I swore I would never do it again unless I got starving babies I can't feed any other way, because they're very detailed, they're very time-consuming, and so that's how it's being done now. It's really, they're doing it themselves, and some of those folks need some technical support, and you're absolutely right. It's not going to be a statewide rush. Not all agencies are going to need this, but we certainly have some out there who do need it and will benefit from it. Mr. Chair, at the proper time, I'd like to respond to what the Commissioner said.
All right, Mr. Holcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are for Mr. Neal. First, did you have an opportunity to express some of your concerns in the Senate, similar to what you've shared with us?
I had some conversations with Senator Kirk.
Okay. And then in terms of the bill itself, when I first read it, the grant funding jumped out at me as being that you might need to provide funds, but listening to you, I understand that you interpreted it as being grant writing, and so.
Well, I also agree with your interpretation that the way that reads would be we would be providing some grant funding as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. And then to maybe echo Representative Gravely's question, are y'all doing some of this now on an informal basis of getting calls and then just kind of helping as you can, or is this truly a new area that you would be asked to go into?
So if we were to receive a call, we obviously would take that call and we would try to answer any questions that we may have. As far as being involved in the writing of a grant, we have on a couple of occasions. We have a grant with Forsyth County right now, where Forsyth County has a mental health task force, and they pursued a grant to look at the gaps in providing services for the mental health in Forsyth County. How many of them were getting services in jail versus outside of jail? What's happening? Kind of tracking them. We helped with that application process to a degree. We're providing, through our Statistical Analysis Center, we're providing research for that grant as well. There is funding in that grant for our agency, which helps us to be able to provide that capacity. Those types of situations have come up from time to time, but certainly not to the point to where we would say that that's something that we consistently do, and for us to now begin to offer that on a regular basis around the state is clearly an expansion of our scope.
Okay, and my final question, certainly understanding what you've said in terms of having the expertise but not having the capacity, and I think that that's a strain that everybody has, which is why you're being asked potentially to carry this responsibility, because other organizations don't have the organic ability to handle some of these responsibilities. Would you be open to making the language more flexible, so it's a may instead of a shall, and just if you have the capacity, or are you more in favor of not approving this at all?
Mr. Chairman, I understand the responsibility of the legislature. I served in that capacity for a number of years. I absolutely respect the wishes of the legislature and what they would like to do. What I would say to you very, very clearly is we do not want in our enabling legislation responsibilities that we cannot fulfill. If you choose to go with may to where it's clear that it's something that we're not going to be asked to do and expected to do without capacity, that's a different conversation that I would rather allow you all to have that conversation without my input. But the way it's written, I don't want to see that expectation on us when I know we don't have the capacity to fulfill it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I know that I asked you a very direct question, but I very much appreciate the direct response. It's very helpful. Thank you.
Let me see if I can pull you out of the fire before you get too much deeper in, Jay. You know, as I understand the author of the bill, you want to codify what they, pretty close to what they're already doing, so it'll be codified that they're there to assist.
Yes, sir.
Provide
And
certain assistance.
that's correct.
As I understand from the department, their concerns are that they may not always have the capacity or the resources to do this. So if I might make a recommendation that we do a little bit of wordsmithing on, starting on line 14. Somewhere interject, it looks to me like the first sentence is pretty well.
Line 45, Chairman, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, line 45. starting on line 45 and 46, then at where the word council starts, basically what we're saying, that's just an enhancement, because we're saying in here to provide technical support and assistance to any local law enforcement agency to enhance the effectiveness of such agency. And then basically, it's a little redundant, but it's adding more language, where they would lack access to adequate technical support. It's just sort of embellishing that. But what if we do some wordsmithing in this section right here, the guts of the bill, and put something to the tune of when the council determines that it has the capacity and the resources and the expertise.
Well, we certainly can look at that, Mr. Chair. If that's, I'm certainly here at the will of the committee. Can I share with you what I passed out, the handout? Sure. And I have great respect for the commissioner. I remember him from his days and serving in the House as well. And what you have before you, you'll see, and I know there's a lot of numbers. This is the FY16 and FY17 budget for CJCC, and as well as the current year, FY18. I asked Senate Research to pull this, and the only thing you really need to look at, CJCC receives a lot of federal money, and they do a lot of work for victims and so forth, and that's in their scope. But they also receive some state dollars. So I want you to notice in FY16, if you'll notice those, the little box at the bottom down here. At the bottom, the state funding that remained at the end of the year was $178,179 and change. That was at FY16. And FY17, state funding, this is just state funding only, was $132,276 and some change. So they have some state funding that's been left over the last 2 years in their budget at least. This year they've spent less than half of their budget, if I'm not mistaken. It's there, 42% I believe is what's there. Maybe that's what's left. But nevertheless, here's what the last conversation the commissioner and I had, I asked him, I said, look, in business, guys, we don't decide that we're going to do something different in our business, and the first thing we're going to do is figure out how to give Sally the raise because she's the one going to be doing it. We say, Sally, we're going to implement this new procedure or this new thing, and then as we go forward, we may see that we need some more funding or to change some things around or whatever. And I asked the commissioner, I said, can you guys just take this year, do it for a year, and come back to us? You'll have opportunity to come back mid-year. When we start next year, they'll be able to come back and say, you know what, we've had a lot of demands. We're going to need some help in the supplemental budget. We could look at it then. Or they can come back and say, you know, we'll be okay this year, but next year we're going to need X amount of dollars due to the demand. I don't see funding something that we don't even know what the demand is yet. Because, again, I think this is you're going to have mostly your Tier 1 counties that are going to be, you know, asking for technical assistance. And that's something else I want to point out. To me, it's pretty clear on line 45 to provide technical support and assistance. Nowhere in there does it say they provide grant funding or anything. Certainly, we understand that if we ask some agency to provide funding, we got to put that in their budget. There's no question about that. That's not what this is saying at all. We're just asking for the technical support. On the second page of your handout, I went ahead, and the commissioner's already done a pretty good job of showing you some of the things that they already do. One of the things I wanted to point out was the bulletproof vest. Yes, there are other organizations that have those available, but they're limited, just like all grant funding. Anything that's out there, it has limitations, and the commissioner was correct. You may have 10 people apply for a grant, but only one of them is going to get it. And sometimes none of them get it the first go-around. It's 2 or 3 times before that grant's awarded. But they're already doing some of these things. And then the last page there that you see is trainings that they're already doing. So, again, I think this is in their purview. I think it's something that they already do. I would prefer to pass this bill as is, and let's go ahead and give it a year. And again, they would have the opportunity to come back. This would take effect July 1, and they could come back in January and say, you know what, guys, we've had a big outpour. We do have some state funds that were left over from this year, and at least that's been the record for the last 2 years, that they could maybe use and apply towards this technical support that's going to be needed. So I think that they're in a good position to at least start there.
All right. Any questions of the committees, other committee members? Is there, you want to follow up?
I would like to respond to one thing, Mr. Chairman. to help you understand a little bit about state funds, we receive about $1 million a year in state funds for our agency. We receive around $25 million a year for accountability courts. We receive around $7 or $8 million a year for juvenile justice incentive grant funds. We receive some domestic violence grant funds as well. And those funds are awarded through an application process. Specifically, the accountability courts, individual accountability courts request or submit their grant application to the Council of Accountability Court Judges, which is administratively attached to us. The funding committee of CACJ decides how those grants will be distributed around the state. We monitor very closely the spending of our accountability courts. Each quarter we look to make sure that the accountability courts are on track to spend out the grant that we've awarded to them. And if they've spent less than 25% of the grant after the first quarter, we look at de-obligating some of their grant to make it available to other courts that that the CACJ wasn't able to fund fully initially. So we monitor that very closely. We obligate every bit of those accountability court grants and those juvenile justice incentive grants, but it's a reimbursement-based grant. And at the end of the year, we only expend the amounts of those accountability court funds and juvenile justice grant funds based on how they have been spent, the accountability courts and the juvenile justice incentive grant programs across the state. The money, the 100 and something thousand that was left in 2015, when you look at that money that was left in our state funds, that wasn't our funds. That was the juvenile justice incentive grant funds and the accountability court funds, where our sub-grantees failed to spend down their entire grant. And what they did not spend down would then be de-obligated and returned to the state. So that's where that money comes from. We can't use that money. That money is not ours to be used.
Any questions of the committee? Mr. Clark?
So, Commissioner, just to understand correctly, the money that the $310,000+ that you're saying was returned to the state, you could not spend that.
That's correct.
Okay.
That was obligated for accountability courts or juvenile justice incentive grants, and those grants were not fully expended. And when you're talking about the volume of grants that we handle through juvenile justice and accountability courts, to only return, we would love to not return any, but when it's a reimbursement-based grant and you're dependent on all of those sub-grantees around the state to spend it down during the year, to be able to come that close, I think is a pretty efficient use of those funds.
So you are handling a large workload dealing with grants. Do you feel like providing the technical assistance, because it is a lot of work to write a grant, do you feel like providing that technical assistance to all these different agencies around the state that need it would become a heavy load on your agency, or do you feel like you can currently handle and have the capacity to handle as needed, or as you can provide the technical assistance?
We have the capacity to handle what we're doing, and that's all the capacity that we have. During grant season, our grant writers are working overtime every week, getting those grants out that we currently administer.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from any of the members? Is there anyone else here that wishes to be heard? Question, Mr. Petrie.
Yes, actually, Mr. Neal, I was just looking at some simple math here. I wanted to get you to confirm something for me. So indeed, if you mentioned the accountability court, you got about $25 million a year in funding. If you look at the 2017 leftover state funds, that's $132,000. That's 0.528%. So that's quite small.
Yes.
Is that am I accurately looking at? Is that correct?
I think that's
to make
correct.
your
My
point,
deputy
is that pretty correct?
Yes.
It's okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions from any of the committee members? If not, what's the mood of the committee? Mr. Clark.
Yeah, can I make a suggestion that we hold off on this and work with the senator and the commissioner and maybe come up with that language that Representative Holcomb had discussed? I think we as a committee were worried about putting new burdens on the agency that they might not be able to handle.
Are you making a motion that we hold the bill or table the bill, or probably just hold it for future work?
Yes, sir. Just to hold, because table would mean it's,
All right, well, let me see if we have anyone that's willing to make a motion. Is there any member who will make a motion? Yes, sir, Mr. Gravely.
I'd like to make a motion to table until further notice, please.
That's not the motion I'm looking for.
I'd like to withdraw my motion, Mr. Chairman.
It's a pretty good, thank you, Mr. Gravely, good idea. All right, tell you what, since we have, since everybody seems to have their throat seem to be clogged up on this one, why don't we hold this bill?
Okay.
And, Mr. Clark? Mr. Holcomb? Thank you. Which one of you guys wanna work with the senator? Would you three work with the senator? And see if y'all can get something worked out? And then we will move this bill forward on this week as soon as y'all tell me that y'all got it worked out.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that.
The senator's put some work into this, and we don't want to belabor it. I want to get it moving where you can start appearing in front of rules.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, Senator. Let's see, what else do we have? We have one other bill, and I have told Senator Tate that I'd bring that bill forward today, and she's not here today. This deals with school safety. If you look on lines 23, very straightforward, it says every public school and private school shall conduct drills with students, teachers, and other school personnel on the execution of such school safety plans in such form and at such intervals based upon guidance from Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency. Is anybody from GEMA here? Well, they made a mistake. They're liable to wind up having a whole lot more lumped on them. All right? All right. Committee, y'all see what she is asking. Bottom line, she's saying that on a regular interval that the schools need to have drills in safety. Some schools probably do it. This is all schools. Every public school and private school. All right? Gosh, all of them are flashing now. Mr. Clark.
I will, to that comment about aren't they already doing it, my wife's a teacher in public school, and they do them, but they're, I think having some support with GEMA to kind of direct on how to perform a proper drill would help, because to her point, she had mentioned that they're always they're notified when they're going to happen, and that they're in their classroom already, and they're not in everyday scenarios where they might be out at recess and then all of a sudden a code red is called. That could happen in real life, and I think the drills need to replicate real life scenarios a little more. So I think it's a good bill.
All right. Mr. Workhauser.
Thank you. I guess my question was, don't we have a similar bill in the House on this side, and does this differ? Isn't there a House? Okay, well, never mind. Go ahead.
All right. Mr. Gravely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do the schools currently coordinate or receive guidance from GEMA and Homeland Security on their training? So specifically, the answer to my question is, we're currently doing, I know my local schools do fire drills. We do loss prevention if we have someone come in that's not identified or signed in, so that we don't have abduction. Would we not need to specifically state if we're trying to get active shooter drills? I don't know of any school that's doing it. Maybe some are, but I don't know.
They're called Code Red.
They're called Code Red. And these are specific drills geared toward what would happen in an active shooter situation.
Or some kind of active shooter situation in the local community that might be
Because some of and the reason I pose the question, Mr. Chairman, is I have had several instances where some schools in our community, due to that situation, they weren't on campus though. So there has been an active shooter drill or a code red, as you said, where there has been identified an incident in the community and the school goes on lockdown, but none, to my knowledge, in my area are doing anything where there's actually an active shooter on campus. And what would the school do in a situation like that? So I don't know if it needs to be specific in that regard, or if we need, it's just a question I'm
You know, it's pretty
thinking.
well open-handed right now, because to review such safety plans, you know, this isn't just about the possibilities of active shooter, this could be
All
natural
encompassing.
disasters, all encompassing. I mean, you know, in this day and time, we live in a very sketchy environment. All right.
Okay.
Finished, Mr. Abley?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Taylor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do think that this is including all safety, and in light of what we've gone through as a nation, I do think something does need to be there, and I do think it needs to be attached to GMA. And I think they need to give directive to the school. They're not here today. I wish that they were, but again, I think it could be a bomb scare, it could be a shooter, or as simple as a fire drill, which we know they do a lot now. But this is something I do think that needs to be planned and it needs to be coordinated, and it has to be the same program everywhere.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just recommend that without the senator here and without anyone from the, from the school system here or from GMA, we might ought to just talk about this another time. I don't know that, I know when I was a little kid back in ancient times, we were doing fire drills, and I'm sure we're still doing them today. So I need to understand better the need for this to be able to have an educated dialogue about it.
Anyone else wishes to be heard on this? Mr. Norris?
This is a very important issue, we all know that. It's a timely discussion, we all know that as well. GMA does have a connection to the school systems in terms of safety plans, and it has been in the law for a number of years, and they do a good job of helping with those plans. But I would just, I don't have the bill in front of me, but I would urge, for instance, Mr. Bradley's conversation about active shooters, it is important, that is one aspect, we need to do that, and we are doing it, the PDs and the SOs are doing that. And I would just urge any language in this bill, if we're gonna do those kinds of drills, it's not gonna be a state agency that comes in if there's an active shooter. Generally, it's gonna be your local police department, or your sheriff's office, and those are the people, I can't speak for Frank, but I bet I can speak for Frank when I say this. Our sheriffs are already meeting with school systems all over the state, and in the city school systems, I'm sure they are too. There's a lot going on in this area. We actually, at the Sheriff's Association, are talking to some experts in the field to actually use asset forfeiture for us to help with school safety purposes, and we already do it. So there's a lot going on. I just wanted to encourage, when this conversation continues, to make sure the language is clear that whatever GMA does, it needs to incorporate the use of that local sheriff's office and PD, because they're the people that's going to show up. So, thank you very much, and we look forward to further conversation.
Thank you, Terry. Anyone want to ask any questions of Terry? Frank?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Frank Montgomery, Executive Director of Police Chiefs. Sometimes I agree with Terry, or sometimes I don't. This time I agree. I agree with him. It is the local school systems get together with their sheriff's departments and the police departments, the programs together that work. And if they happen to be a good police department, good sheriff's department, they coordinate with the school authorities and integrate all of the measures they could to protect the children in the school system. So GMA does provide some oversight, it provides some guidance for it. Just this last week, I received an excellent email from the police chief of Marietta, who has a program going and bring all the school systems in Marietta together with all of the responsible parties, which I absolutely certainly include Cobb County Sheriff's Office, to get involved if there is a situation where there's a breach of security. So we're looking at now an issue where we're taking in a state agency to help municipalities and counties to actually perform it, do work in tandem with the school systems, and that seems to be the best approach to work. If you would just demand somebody get help, they don't know how to follow those. So it really depends. It's a function of the school authorities, the municipalities, and the counties to make it work. I hope that helped rather than confused, but the one point is Harry Norris was right. I want you to walk that one down. Okay.
You shocked him so much he had to leave the room. Yes, sir.
It sounds as if the infrastructure looks to be, you have some type of an SOP, some type of a protocol that is managed or rather even be created by GEMA, Homeland Security, but it's actually executed at the municipal or county level with the PDs and the sheriff and the school system.
Some enhance it. So
Okay.
if you happen to have a school district like Marietta, and I use that as an example, they enhance it, and they make sure all parties are involved, they make sure the resources are available, the resources are lacking, they budget for those resources. So you really need that working together relationship to make it an effective
Absolutely.
product. And in state certified agencies, which is a select group of agencies that elect to go into the program, they always enhance their training in that particular area. There are about 123 agencies, which are sheriffs and police, that are in that program because the standards demand extra amount of attention given to that. General smaller agencies, whether the county or city, may not have any policy and may not get involved directly, so they should work closer to GMP and obtain resources and guidance.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Anyone else does anyone here wish to be heard on this issue? A little discussion among the committee members. Y'all see some other language that could be put into this to clean it up some?
Yeah.
The intent is that we're requiring the public and private schools to have drills. Now, is drills the proper word, or planning and the execution of those? Yes, sir. Yes, sir, Mr. Workhauser.
Yeah, so my suggestion would be at on line 26, after comma, in cooperation with the local law enforcement that would respond to the prospective school. So that we don't just say local law enforcement, because depending on it could be municipality, it could be county, but most every school knows which law enforcement entity would be involved. And that way those two, GEMA and the local entity, are coordinating.
All right, would you repeat your?
Yeah. On line 26, which is basically the end of the bill. Yes, the end of the bill. It'd be comma, in cooperation with the local law enforcement that would respond to the prospective school. And that way we know both groups are involved.
Mr. Redondo and Mr. Norris, would y'all hold hands and come up here? I know how much y'all love each other, so. But since y'all are working so well in the public's interest today. Exactly. Y'all heard the suggestion, and I'm trying to see if it might be need to rewrite this. Julius, you're the professional wordsmith. You get the gist of what he's saying and where it would be most impact.
In cooperation with, well, let's don't use sheriff because it could be a city in some cases. So in cooperation with the local law enforcement that would respond to the prospective school. 457.
457. I hear what you're saying, but should we only restrict it to just the law enforcement? Some counties, you have their emergency management services, their first responders, and all of these. These are all folks that need to be involved in that. Public safety personnel is probably the best description. Scott, what do you think?
Purposes of conversation, we've had conversation with Gina before, they prioritize who has command authority, and usually with Gina, they call down there, and then they prioritize it based upon the jurisdiction. So I think it's covered, is there that you,
Can I, Julius, if you can help me out here too. I'm reading the code section that this is in, starting in line like 10 down, and it says every public school, and then in line 14, school safety plans of public schools shall be prepared with input from students enrolled at the school, parents, legal guardians of such students, teachers in that school, community leaders, other school employees, and school district employees, and local law enforcement, fire service, public safety, and emergency management agencies. So it sounds like in code it's already there. I'm wondering if we could strike what's being added to the code in line 23 through 26, and then everywhere where it says every public, and then put and private school, and then at the end down here where it has and local law enforcement on line 17, local law enforcement, fire service, public safety, and emergency management agencies, and then you can add in something about GEMA and Homeland Security. Well, you could put shall prepare a school safety plan and execute. I mean,
Just use her word, conduct.
and conduct. Shall have and conduct a school safety plan. Shall prepare and is redundant. So isn't the whole bill redundant then if it's already?
Wonder if we just need to carry out the bill.
Well, so if it's already laid out like this with locals and GEMA and everybody in the affected, parents and everybody, students, couldn't you just add a simple line that just says, and these plans shall be conducted, like, you know, the drill should be conducted in accordance with the rest of the code section?
Well, what about on line 10, if you just said, shall prepare a school safety plan and conduct drills? That way you got all the players in there. Well, you gotta add, on line 10, you add. You add and public, you add, on line 10, every public and private school. And then after the word safety plan, and conduct drills.
Yeah.
School safety plans of private schools may be prepared. We could say shall be prepared. Well, I mean, if this, I mean, if we go with what this bill says, I mean, it's a shall. I mean, it's every public and private school shall conduct. Well, so Julius, you know the code section. Are we getting to the point where is this kind of redundant language, and all we have to do is add in shall be executed, the plan shall be executed with?
You certainly may.
How do you get private schools to acquiesce to this if you guess it doesn't? Yeah, it's broad, it's very broad scope deal.
Yeah.
So it's only as good as the enforcement authority and how they, I agree, state and local will do it, and GMA will do it. But you get to the question of, is it a K school or is it a K school? So, there's not a handicap basically unless it's an insurance liability.
You get into daycares and everything else?
It's just a further question. I'm just saying I see this as being very broad.
We've already covered this already code on public schools.
But is it enforced? That's what the.
Well, I think quite frankly, the current code statute is more message that in these times that we live in, that they need to be laying their plans out there. And if that being said, as a continuance of what Representative Workhauser said, on line 10 after public school, when you say every public school and private school, at private school shall prepare a school safety plan and conduct drills as necessary. Because you've already got the rest of the language with all the law enforcement and everybody in. Let's get to another one. Let's see, let's talk 'em.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I pulled up the Georgia Department of Education, and they have a whole bunch of information on crisis management, and it's really comprehensive, and it includes deciding who will be in charge during a crisis, establish the crisis response team, develop clear and consistent policies and procedures, so on and so forth. And it also says conduct training in the school crisis response procedures at least annually and make it part of any new employee orientation. So I think schools are already doing this and required to. I don't necessarily automatically oppose it being in code, but I'm not convinced that it's necessary. Yes, sir.
Right. I think you're exactly right. No? All right, Mr. Gravely.
I agree with the points that are being discussed. If it's just a matter of us to set precedent because of the times we live in, shall prepare a school safety plan and conduct. I think we can take care of what's being added in the last part of 23 down to 26 with just one word, conduct. But Julius, if I'm hearing you correctly, private schools and public schools are separated, and there is no shall in the private. But some of these private schools aren't receiving state dollars, correct?
That does not prohibit us from requiring them to
Okay.
have a safety plan.
Okay. Is there any prohibition, Julius or Mr. Chairman, that would require us from doing that for a private school? Simply because in line 18, it then goes on to say, after the public school is covered, school safety plans of private schools may be prepared with input from students and so forth and so on. I'm fine with adding it. I just didn't know if there was a prohibition or some type of caution that you had, Julius, in combining the two.
I can't think of a reason, because private schools have other requirements that they have to.
I understand.
Right. I mean, when it's proposed, that's when once again, they can tell you why it's separated.
Okay. I just want to make sure we were all clear.
Cheerless, let me ask you the question. This is a follow back up on Mr. Workhouser's on line 10 where we add private school after public school and private school shall prepare a school safety plan and conduct necessary drills as deemed necessary. And then strike the new language that started on 23, just get rid of that language in its entirety. That would be accomplishing the same thing without getting into a fuss since Jim was not here.
So are we saying we want to mandate to private schools too, that they shall?
Well, that was my question.
Or
In
so
the
we
matter,
could-
in the matter of public safety, I don't care if it's a public school or a private school. If you have an active shooter situation or you have a tornado that strikes, they're just as dead if they're a private school student as they are a public school student. You may.
Do we give them, everything you said up until as deemed necessary? Does that give some wiggle room to maybe, well, we can do it, but we don't have time? If we just stop it as every public and private school shall prepare a school safety plan and conduct training drills or drills, and then just start with, pick back up with to help curb the growing incident about schools.
Whatever the will of this committee is.
Okay.
So,
We've already taxed my feeble brain a little bit more than I'm used to. But, Mr. Clark.
if I may, if we do that, where in line 10 we put every public and private school shall prepare a school safety plan and conduct drills on line 10, then we, in my opinion, we go down to line 18 where it starts with school safety plans of private schools may, all the way down to line 22, updated annually. We just need to strike that then, because we would strike that part out too. And then on line 22, I'm getting like such plans of public schools, right there you say public and private schools shall be submitted to the local emergency agency. We would need to amend that and put and private there as well.
I don't know why we would need to take that out, because if you look at the end on line 22, 23, you got that magic statement that says such plans of private schools. But we're already treating private schools separately with a certain level of kid gloves. And it says such plans shall be reviewed and if necessary, updated annually.
But we're in that section, it's a may. The whole thing is a may. Where did I see the may at? In line 18, school safety plans of private schools may. So that whole thing, if in line 10 we include private school, we're making it a shall. And so that whole section on line 18 needs to be removed because it's a may.
Whatever the will of the committee.
If you're gonna strike that, then you need in line 14, where it says school safety plans of public, there you add and private.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would strike, the sentence that starts on line 18, you would strike that all the way down to line 22.
And then on line 22, also add where it says such plans of public and private, and then put the and private there as well. And I think we cover the intention of this bill, and
All right, so do you wish to? put
their
that
fault
in
for not
form-
being here.
Do y'all wish to put this in the form of a motion?
I'll make a motion, Mr. Chairman.
All right, state your motion.
On line 10, every public and private school shall prepare a school safety plan and conduct drills. And the rest of the code is good. Down to 14, at the last half of 14, school safety plans of public and private, and then continue all the way down to the middle of line 18, and then strike, starting with the sentence, school safety plans of private, strike that all the way down until the end of line 21. Actually, down to line 22, and the second half of 22 say, such plans of public and private schools shall, and then stop the bill at the second half of line 23, and then you're done.
Still saying that it'll be submitted to the local emergency management agency, and then that's it.
Yes,
Strike
it
the new language.
stops at agency.
Strike the new language.
Yes, we're stopping it at after the word annually. Yeah, because it's already in code. Yeah.
All right, we have a motion. If I'm understanding, the only thing that I've really kept up to, we had private schools after public schools on line 10, and conduct drills. Then you're talking about striking, starting on line what?
Striking, okay, we are adding the words "and private" on lines 14 and 22.
All right,
And then we're striking the second half of line 18, starting at school safety. We're striking the rest of the bill except for, we're leaving in one sentence on line 21, such plans shall be reviewed and if necessary updated, well, those two sentences, annually. Such plans of public and private shall be submitted to the local emergency management agency. Got it? If you ever need an assistant, let me know.
any further questions from any of the committee members to that amendment? We have a motion, do we have a second? We have a motion and a second, any further discussion? Any subsequent motions? All right, all in favor of the amendment, say aye. And I'm sorry I got out of turn. We need a motion on the bill first. We have a motion on the bill due pass. Do we have a second? Now, we have an amendment. We've got a motion and a second. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Opposed? Now, any subsequent amendments? Any other member wishes to be heard? All in favor of the amended as a committee substitute, say aye. Opposed? And ayes have it. Anything else to bring up? Members gonna be, we got members that's gonna be working with Senator Kirk.
Yes, sir.
And
Clark and Polk.
look forward to hearing from y'all. If there's nothing else, this meeting stands adjourned.